Hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about materials and specifically talking about how to split out the U and V channels so that you can modify them separately in a material instance. But as we cover that, you'll maybe learn some other tips and tricks regarding materials as well. So here I have just the standard minimal default starter content scene, and that's fine for what we're going to look at. This can apply to many other situations as well. So go for the concept here, not the exact example. So I'm going to apply maybe this rough cobblestone here to the surface. And maybe you think that looks fine. Maybe you want to adjust the tiling, or maybe you're applying this to a piece of geometry that if we select this guy here and scale it a bunch, it looks stretched and weird, right? So you might have, depending on what geometry you're using, the UV layout might makes for some strange looking tiling. So let's talk about how we can modify this so that you can adjust the U and V separately. Now, let's stretch this crazy out that way. So we need to stretch it only in one direction, ideally. So I'm going to open up the material here. And if we look in this particular material, you got to go fishing around for a little bit. Let's see, where is this? Wow, that feeds a lot of different aspects. So this node here, in any of your materials, you're likely going to have a texture coordinate node that can modify the U and the V tiling, which is okay for a start, but gets to be a little bit inconvenient when you're going to be doing material instance uses as well, which we're going to set up in a second. So you could technically, and it would work fine at a small scale. If I move this around a little bit so we can see the surface here. Let's see, is this U or V? Let's try making this 10 times in U and saving to see how that looks on our surface here. Now again, this isn't the ideal way to do it, which is why we're going to go over a better way to do it, but I'm just setting up the issue here for us. And all right, so it wasn't the U axes that I wanted to change. Let's say we'll try it over here. And again, the pain of this will be resolved with what we're going to set up in a second. I just want to, again, lay the foundation here of what we're trying to get done. So here we've modified it. All right, it's a little bit too much, but you get the idea, right? So you can modify them separately, but notice how we're having to save the material each time here to see how it works. And then what if we had this applied to different floor surfaces and we needed each one to potentially have a different setting? Okay, so now this isn't looking too far off the original situation. But again, this is kind of inconvenient having to come in here in this node. And again, we want this scalable so that we can do it for other properties as well. So let's first talk about setting that up. So if we have a parent material here, I'm going to right click and make a material instance. And I'll leave it named as it is. It's the same thing with inst at the end. Actually, you know what I'm going to do is what most people do. I'm going to get rid of the inst at the end and throw a MI at the front. You'll recognize this from the Quixel materials you might be downloading in the future as well. They use the MI naming convention. And when you rename it, it's going to drop down to the bottom in this case because MI comes after all these M underscores. So I'm going to open this. And when you're using an instance, you'll have an opportunity to override parameters in here. However, you don't see any parameters for adjusting U and V separately. So let's talk about how to get a U and V in here. Let's go back to our material here. So in this value here, we have the U and the V. And what we can't do is, as we've seen on other nodes, you can't right click and turn it into a parameter in this particular node. So we got to get a little tricky here to be able to split these out separately so that we can modify them. So what we're going to do is we're going to hold down 1 and click, and 1 and click again. These are our two values that we're going to multiply that U and V by here. So I'm going to name this one. Actually, I need to right click and convert this to a parameter, as well as this one, convert that to a parameter. That'll allow us access to override it in the material instance. Again, you'll see what that is in a minute. Let's just call this one U tile, and we'll call this one V tile. You can kind of call it whatever you want, just something you would recognize in the material instance. All right, so here's our values, and let's just default each of those to 1. So our initial difference we won't notice. we still want to keep this original texture coordinate, and let's set this back to 1, its default value there. But we want to be able to modify these two values by these two parameters as a multiply. So hold M and click to get a multiply node. And if you hold control, you can control drag that entire chunk there and plug it in to the multiply. And then we have our original texture coordinate U and V values going in here. Now here comes the sneaky part of how do we multiply. We have two values in here, U and V tiling, and we want to multiply those two values by these two independent values, but you see there's only one input here. So we need to combine these two together using an append vector node. So grab an append vector, and what this does is put this into A, this into B. This makes a 2 vector value coming out of this end. And when you have a 2 vector value multiplying times a 2 vector value, which is the texture coordinate, if you read this pop-up, it tells you the multiplication happens per channel. So that the first multiplies the first, the second multiplies the second. So this is exactly what we need by making an append so that we can make a vector to multiply by a vector and plug that in here. And now this is set up so that you have these two independent parameters that you can use to modify this set of parameters that's stuck inside this node here. So I'm going to save. And again, this is on the parent material. And as soon as that saves, the way the instance works, it inherits the changes of the parent. So now you'll see that you have access here to modify that U and V tile separately. So one thing we need to do as well is apply this instance to our little plane out here. And you didn't see anything change really because we're not overriding any value, so it's doing the same thing as the parent at the moment. But you'll notice down here the MI is the new material that's been assigned. So now I can come up here. If I want to modify the U, I can do that. And what's nice is you get instant update here as well. And I can turn that back off if I want. So if you turn this on, that enables whatever value you have here. If you have it off, then it just accepts whatever the parent is pushing into that. So in this case, I actually want to modify the V to tighten that up a little bit. So now you have control over these two different values of your U and V so that you can modify per use of your material. And one other advantage of having these pulled out separately is, offhand I don't see where you would use it in this exact example, but if you have some cinematics and you're using a level sequence, you can animate those values once you've promoted them in an instance. So let me show you what I mean. Let's just make a mess in the materials here and add a level sequence. Terrible organization skills, but it's just for an example. So if I add this plane into my level sequence, and maybe I want to animate these U and V values here inside my level sequence for whatever reason, just showing something you can do, you would go and add your static mesh component into your level sequence. And then you want to add the element 0 is our material that we're using. And then once you have access here to the material, because it's an instance, you have access to those particular parameters that you promoted so that you can modify them here inside a level sequence. So say adding the V tiling, the current value is 5 and whatever it was before, something like 1. Then you hit play and then you're modifying your texture over time. Again, in this exact case, whatever, I don't think you would need that, but just so you can see when you promote variables in your materials, you can access them here in the level sequence. Let's take a look at how Quixel handles materials and this kind of thing, and you'll see that they've already have most of these set into their material instances. So if we go to the bridge, go to surfaces, and let's, for example, get some bark, birch. I'm just clicking on whatever's here, and I got to sign in really quick. And then let's download and add it to our project. And here we have this material just came in. So if I double click to take a look at it, notice it's MI, it's a material instance. So I'm going to double click, and if we open this up, we've got tiling settings here, and they've already split out the tiling into X and Y. So you can turn that on. They use X and Y. I used U and V, but same idea. So then you can come in here and do the multiplier and do the same thing using the instances that Quixel has set up for you. So that's the idea of what we did by ourselves, because you're not always going to use a pre-set up material instance from Quixel. You may be building your own. So it's handy to know how to set that up. Maybe you're creating your own simpler material and you just want to come in here, create a material, and you want to use the textures that they provided here. Let's just dock this over out here, minimize this. Here's our level, right? So here's a handy little trick that you may or may not be aware of. So here on our materials tab, I want those 3 textures in here. So I'm going to come over here and select those 3 textures. I'm going to drag them up onto this tab, let it sit for a second, and then drag it down here. So that's extra little bonus tip for you today. Let's see, this is our color into the base color and our normal into the normal. And if you grab these from Quixel, you'll see the back of the name here tells you ORD. So O is for your occlusion, that's your red channel. The R is for roughness, your green, going to roughness. And then if you're using displacement, you can use the other channel as well. To see what those look like individually, if you double click the texture there, you can say that is your ambient occlusion, that is your roughness, and that is your displacement. So that's just the 3 channels of the texture that you get. And I'm using those there. And again, if you were setting all of this up from scratch and you want to modify the tiling, you want to hold down U and click to get a texture coordinate node. All right, so you would run these into your 3 different inputs here. And again, we're just looking at the same thing as we saw earlier. You can modify it once here, but if you're going to be using this and using instancing and want to control your U and V separately, again, just really quick, hold 1 and click, hold 1 and click. Take those and convert to parameters. Give them a name. Run those into a pen vector so that you create a 2-channel vector out of those 2 individual values. And then hold M to get a multiply node. In this case, again, control click and drag to pull out all those little sprouts. And run that into A, run that into B. And now you've set up, again, you got to name these and save and all that kind of stuff. And now you're set up for a to be able to modify these values in an instance. However, you might say, what happened here? That's just because these default values are defaulting to 0. So if you come in here and set them to 1, it'll look a little bit better. All right, that was how you would grab some Quixel textures and make your own simpler material if you don't want to deal with their super complex one. But, you know, theirs is pretty nice, so you may want to just stick with theirs. All right, that's it for today. Tomorrow's Christmas. Wanted to sneak in one more video, so enjoy this, a little gift from me to you for Christmas. Merry Christmas, everybody. See you next year.